Now my talk today is on women in the War of 1812. And I'm sure that a number of you could probably recognize the woman who's on the screen there. I'm going to have to move a little closer, I guess, with my mouse. It's not responding. If I said to you that she relates to a box of chocolates, I am sure you would know exactly and precisely who I was talking about. This is Laura Secord. Yeah, bring it around. I don't need this. I don't need a podium. Yeah. So we have Laura Secord on the screen here. Can't find my mouse. There we go. And my talk tonight, as I've said, is on women in the War of 1812. Am I in your way?
No.
Can you see? Do I need to sit down to do it?
No.
Everybody can see? Okay, great. My agenda tonight, I'm going to talk about 4 different things. First thing that I'm going to talk about is Laura Secord herself. And I'm also going to talk about Fannie Doyle. Laura Secord and Fannie Doyle both had husbands who fought at the Battle of Queenston Heights. We know Laura Secord because she's a Canadian. Fannie Doyle is the American counterpart of Laura Secord. If you're in the States and you talk about Fannie Doyle, they would know who Fannie Doyle was. So I will be talking about both of these women tonight. Then I'm going to talk about women and the military. And I will talk about women who were wives of soldiers in the military, but I will also talk about women who actually were in the military. And it seems kind of strange that in 1812 there were actually women in the military. Then I'm going to talk about women in the town of York. And I'm going to talk about that because of the fact that the town of York was the capital of Upper Canada at the time, and that was where our Parliament buildings were located. It's also where the garrison at Fort York was located. And I'll talk very briefly about women in general, a few women in Upper Canada. So I'm going to begin with Laura Secord, and up on the corner of the screen you'll see an image of a very young Laura Secord. The one that we saw at the beginning was Laura in her later years. Laura was born in Massachusetts, and she was the daughter of Thomas Ingersoll and his wife Elizabeth Dewey. She was their firstborn child, and they had 4 daughters. But at age 8, her mother died. Her father remarried, and then he remarried again for a 3rd time when she was about age 14 when her stepmother died. And he raised another family with his 3rd wife. Her father had fought on the American side during the Revolutionary War. And I was very surprised when I looked at the next little bullet that I have here, when it talks about the fact that her father received, when they moved to Upper Canada, actually received a land grant. And at first I was surprised about the fact that we have somebody who fought in the American Revolutionary War receiving a land grant in Upper Canada. But it was so. In 1793, when John Graves Simcoe had the town of York laid out, they were trying to get people to come. They wanted to develop a society here in Upper Canada. So what they did was they were handing out land at the time. So anybody who settled here originally received 1 acre of land in town or adjacent to the town, and they received 100 acres of land in the forests or in the parklands around the town of York. So they were looking to get people here. So he actually did receive a land grant in Upper Canada, even though he was not a loyalist. 1797 saw the marriage of Laura to James Secord. Very quickly, they raised a family of 6 daughters and 1 son. And life wasn't always that easy for Laura at the beginning. Her husband, even though he was a merchant, and had difficulty managing his inventory, had difficulty managing his finances to begin with. I think it took him a little while before he finally settled down and got it under control, that things were working for them. In October of 1812, an American army of regular troops and the New York militia crossed the Niagara River and captured Queenston. Laura and her children made their way to St. David's, where they had family. And when they made their way to St. David's, she spent the day listening. Can you raise it just a tiny bit? Thanks, David. She spent the day listening all day long for the sound of gun firing and cannons that could be heard off in the distance at Queenston, and worrying about what was happening to her home and worrying about what was happening to her husband. So when the day, towards the end of the day, when the shelling died down, Laura decided that she was going to make her way back down to Queenston and check on her husband and her home. Her husband was a member of the 1st Lincoln Militia, and he was wounded in the battle at Queenston Heights. When Laura arrived, she found her husband on the battlefield, and with a British officer, the two of them were managed to get him back to their home, where she was able to tend to him. Laura, in June of 1813, a 37-year-old mother, entered into an act of espionage. This was quite a thing for the young lady. As her husband was in no shape to travel after the Battle of Queenston Heights, the Americans did not take him into capture and take him down to the States. He had wounded his arm and his leg was broken very badly, so he wasn't able to walk. So what they did instead was they billeted 3 officers in their home. And that actually proved advantageous to them because of the fact that with 3 officers in the home, there was food coming into the home. So there was food for Laura to be able to feed her family as well as the officers. The officers occupied 2 bedrooms on the top floor. On one evening, while the officers were there, and frequently groups of them would meet in the home, Laura and her husband overheard the officers discussing an attack on Beaver Dam, and they decided that they needed to act on this. Well, James wasn't able to walk the distances that needed to be traveled, so the only person that could do it was Laura. So she set off on a very arduous journey with the news that the Americans were going to attack the camp of Lieutenant James Fitzgibbon at DeQ's house, about 18 miles west of Kingston. Now the next bullet, when you take a look at this, we're talking about 20 miles. That's not an error. It was 18 miles, but she actually walked 20 miles. She walked 20 miles because she had to avoid the American sentries en route. She had to avoid the Aboriginal camps en route. And she was also being very leery about coming across any bears or snakes en route. She certainly didn't want to meet up with them either. So, she trekked through swamps, and it was very arduous for her. When she'd started off at 5 o'clock in the morning, she went out on the pretext, supposedly, of finding a cow. And when she went out, she supposedly went out in her nightgown. We're not exactly sure just what happened with some of these things because the Secords were very reticent to talk about it after the war. They also talked about the fact that she would have gone out without shoes on her feet. Well, I can't see her going out to check on the cows with no shoes on her feet because the cow flaps would be in the field, and I certainly wouldn't want to be walking in the cow flaps in the field. So I'm sure that she must have started out with shoes on her feet. If she did lose them, it may have been in the swamp when she had to trek through the swamp to get there. She stopped her en route to St. David's. Her brother was sick, so he couldn't go with her. Elizabeth, his girlfriend, went for a while with her, but then turned around and went back. And she actually finished the trek on her own. So that 18-mile journey became 20 miles in a circuitous sort of route to get around things. When she arrived at the Loyalist native encampment, we arrived there by moonlight, and the following is her account of the event. All arose, and with some yells said, "Woman!" which made me tremble. I cannot express the awful feeling it gave me, but I did not lose my presence of mind. I was determined to persevere. I went up to one of the chiefs, made him understand that I had great news for Captain Fitzgibbon, and that he must let me pass to his camp, or that he and his party would all be taken. The chief at first objected to let me pass, but finally consented. after some hesitation, to go with me and accompany me to Fitzgibbon Station, which was at the Beaver Dam, where I had an interview with him. I then told him what I had heard, that the Americans intended to make an attack upon the troops under his command and would, from their superior numbers, capture them all. Fitzgibbon succeeded in attacking and capturing the entire enemy force at the Battle of Beaver Dam on the 26th of June, 1813, all because of Laura Secord going ahead and making that warning. Must also state that the Aboriginals were very much involved in this as well, and the first attacks that were done by about 400 Aboriginals on the advancing American forces. After the war, like many others in Upper Canada, the Secords lived in poverty. James received a small pension for being wounded and £485 for property damages. He was a merchant. His entire stock would have been wiped out. Shelves in the store were destroyed. There were a number of other things that were taken as well. When the Americans would come through, they would take down fences. They wanted to be able to get rid of anything that was going to stop them from being able to get around very readily. Plus the fences could be used to be burnt to keep them warm. Laura and James submitted several petitions for his military pension, for land and also for appointments for James. He was still, finding it very difficult to work after the injuries that he had sustained during the battle. In 1828, he was appointed register, and in 1833, he was appointed a judge. James died 1841, leaving Laura without any means of financial support. So in 1841, Laura applied for a pension for herself and was not successful. She ran a school at her home in Chippewa as a means of augmenting, her income and providing for herself. In 1861, the Prince of Wales, later to become King Edward VII, visited North America to lay a stone commemorating the death of Sir General Isaac Brock. And when he came, he was handed a list of veterans who had fought in the War of 1812, and on the list was Laura's name. And this captivated him, that there was a woman on the list of men who had fought in the War of 1812. And his interest in Laura led to her receiving an award of 100 pounds of gold. This was the only compensation she received for her act of bravery in preventing a military disaster. And now we come to Fannie Doyle. One of the American soldiers captured at the Battle of Queenston Heights was an artilleryman named Doyle. He had been stationed at Fort Niagara, and his wife remained there after his capture. It was a good place for her to be because she had a place to live, she had food. Her husband would know where to find her when he would finally be released. On 21st of November 1812, British gunners at Fort George commenced heavy bombardment of Fort Niagara. Fannie Doyle took on her husband's responsibilities and aided in the manning of the guns. So, Major George McFeely, commander at Fort Niagara, made the following comment. During the most tremendous cannonading I have ever seen, she would take the ball tongs from any of the men, run to the fire, take up a hot shot, put it in the cannon, and run for another. In May of 1813, American forces under Major General Henry Dearborn took Fort George. So this is a woman that, as I said, is the Laura Secord of the United States. Incredible women, both of them. Now I'm going to talk about women and the military. For soldiers on active duty at Fort York, and the Monahans mentioned this the last time they were here, 6 wives were permitted per 100 men. However, overages were frequently reported at Fort York. Every year they had to report on how many women were on the base. And the commanders at Fort York, or at the garrison at Fort York, felt that if the women were on the base with their husbands, that their husbands were more settled. They weren't worrying about where their family were, what was happening to their family, and the same thing for the wives. So frequently, there were more women on the base than should have been there, along with all of the children that went along with the family. They were not left behind. Now, living quarters for families of the enlisted were merely areas in the barracks with bedding hung to afford some privacy. And I don't know whether or not any of you have visited the garrison at Fort York, but they had bunk beds sort of things that they had in the barracks where the men would start. There'd be about 30 men in each one of the barracks. The beds were about a 3/4 bed. They were wider than a twin bed, but not as wide as a double bed, and much shorter than beds are today, because people were much shorter back then. And what they would do is married people would take the bottom bunk, and they would take bedding and hang bedding around so that they had some degree of privacy. It's not like being today when we all have master suites and everybody has their privacy, kids all have their own bedrooms and some of them with their own bathrooms. That was not the way things were. And this wasn't strange for people. They were living with these sort of conditions. If you think about log houses that people lived in back then, there were usually 2 rooms. So there was one room that was set aside for the cooking and for the meals and for socializing in the evening, and the other room was set aside for sleeping. And it wasn't always one to a bed. So mother and father may have children sleeping in the same bed with them. The children would be sharing beds. You might have 3 side by side and 1 across the bottom. It was not uncommon for them to have to share beds. So for them, this lack of privacy was not a major issue. This was the way they lived. Women received half rations of food, and children received quarter rations. And life as a soldier's wife afforded some degree of comfort for women. If they had been off on their own, there would have been that constant worry about how they were going to get food on the table, what they were going to be doing, how they could protect the children, how they could protect themselves. Living on the base with their husbands, they were at home. There was medical service on the base, so if anything happened to them, they had ready medical service there. There were church services on the base. There was compensation for any work that they did, so they could augment their husband's salary by doing work on the base. They could be doing the laundry, they could be doing cooking, they could be helping out in nursing. So that was a way of compensating them for, and providing a little extra money for them. In 1800s, there was schooling provided on the base, but it wasn't mandatory. In 1812, it was mandatory that all the children on the base had to attend school. This was not mandatory in the province at the time. So this was very much of a plus for them. For the base, they were glad to provide this service because they were looking at getting young men down the line who were trained and could be non-commissioned officers, if they had some education behind them. Education at that time wasn't centered around reading, writing, math. Education at that time was centered around being a loyal citizen and learning how to, obey the crown and serve the crown. But the schooling was there, and that was very much of a plus for them. So, life wasn't all that bad on the base. On May 26, 1814, a regimental order at Fort York stated that the women were to charge 2 pence and a half penny for washing shirts. And any woman who refused to do laundry for that price would be struck off her rations. So obviously somebody was charging a little bit more than what the going rate was for laundry at the time. And it was also interesting because they had 2 types of laundry service. The sergeants' wives, it's sinking down a little bit. The sergeants' wives did all of the laundry for the officers. And I guess they felt that the sergeants' wives had a better idea of how to make the officers' shirts look better. I have no idea. And then the servicemen, the service wives were the ones who did all of the laundry for the servicemen. But this, again, they had to pay for the service for having somebody do their laundry. During the War of 1812, to protect families of soldiers on active duty, an order was given that all wives and children should be sent to Lower Canada for their safety. Now, as a young wife, with a bunch of children, do you want to head off to Montreal or to Quebec to be able to be protected? A lot of them didn't. And there were exceptions, because they still needed people on the base to do the laundry, they still needed people to do the nursing and the cooking. But they were trying to get people to leave the base and head down. Some women actually refused to go, and a later proclamation denied them rations if they remained. If their husbands died, they were limited, very limited in their options. The widow could remarry into the regiment or be left destitute. And Subaltern Gleig asserted that women were perfectly secure of obtaining as many husbands as they may choose. And during the War of 1812, Mary Lucas, a sergeant's widow, married another sergeant in her dead husband's regiment in November of 1813. And widow Mary Porter did the same in September of 1814. Now, if military widows some of them had come over from England and they wanted to return home, they could petition the government for money to be able to return to their homes. But it's very hard to track whether or not this was successful, because we're involving more than one country. Once they got money for their passage back and returned back to their homeland, England, once they got there, there had to be money to get them from wherever the ship landed to their parish. And it was up to the poor laws of the parish to take care of them. So, it's very, very difficult to know whether or not, a lot of these women were successful in returning. On December 18th, 1813, on the eve of battle, Lieutenant Maurice Nolan wrote a loving letter to his dearest Jewel, his wife Agatha, and the next morning he was killed during the assault on Niagara. They had married while he was in the service. And it's amazing the number of marriages that were on the registers of St. James Church for the time of the War of 1812. Agatha was left destitute, without any means of support. In October of 1815, she asked to be placed on the pension list and receive an additional amount of 1 year's salary, as her husband had been killed in action. And as a wife of a killed soldier, she was entitled to that money. In Heritage Matters in February 2012, Kelly Nesbitt, the administrative coordinator of Fort York, wrote, "Apparently, the widow of a promising officer who died a hero's death was forgotten by her country." Now, often women would dress as men and join the military. They weren't going in as women, they were going in as men. And Sarah Rogers of England enlisted under her father's name as a soldier in the British Army in the 1790s and served for more than a decade. She reached the rank of sergeant before being found out, and she later married a fellow soldier and accompanied him on his campaigns. In 1804, a married black woman, aged 21, joined the Royal Navy. She served for at least 12 years and became a captain on the HMS Queen Charlotte. They frequently weren't found out until they were injured in the line of duty and somebody had to administer to them. And then they would discover that this was indeed not a man, it was a woman. It was actually quite easy to conceal it at that time, because it wasn't like today where you had a great big bathtub and everybody got in the bathtub and had a bath. When they washed or changed, they would strip down only to their underwear, and they weren't completely bare or naked around anyone. The shirts for men at that time were sort of a blue zone type affair, so hung loose. They would probably bind themselves as well. But for women, it was a means of securing a wage. And they knew they were secure. They would have a bed. They would have a livelihood. They would have food provided for them. And they didn't have to worry about anyone molesting them because they weren't a woman. So For them it was very advantageous. Another one was Eliza Bromley, and she was American, captured by the British, and became prisoner number 240 at a facility in Quebec on the 9th of June, 1813. And when they discovered her true identity, she was released on the 25th of June, 1813. Now I'm going to talk about women in the town of York. And on the 26th of April in 1813, 14 American ships appeared on the lake near York, which is present-day Toronto. And Mary Baldwin remarked when she saw them on the lake that they were absolutely beautiful. You know, there are all these furrowed sails out there, you know, white sails on the harbor, and you know, she thought they looked beautiful. Well, the results definitely were not beautiful. Several women banded together to flee the town. However, some chose to remain. Among the few who remained were Anne Strawn, Anne Powell, Penelope Beakley, Elizabeth Dorenzi, and Angelique Gibbons. John Strawn was the Anglican minister at Fort York, and on April the 27th, 1813, the military at the fort set fire to the magazine, and the magazine was where they held all of the ammunition for their guns, etc. And when they set fire to the magazine, it blew, and it blew in a tremendous roar, evidently, that could be heard for miles. There was wood going up into the sky, there was metal, there were rocks. It was quite a scene, and there were a huge number of men who were wounded and died on the battlefield that day within the garrison walls. Well, John Strawn, as the minister of York, went out to aid the wounded after sending Anne, his wife and children, to friends outside of the town of York. She had been there overnight, but in the morning when John had to head out to administer to the wounded, she became very fearful, so he wanted to get her out of town. Later on, he decided that he would send Anne and the children off to Cornwall for safety purposes. But unfortunately, when Anne was sent off to Cornwall, she was sexually assaulted by American troops and robbed. So for Anne, the rest of her life was very much marred by the events of this war. Penelope Beakley, who was the wife of the sheriff, remained to defend her home. And because of her strong demeanor and threats, very little was taken from her home. However, they did take all the poultry. They were going to feed the troops that were there. I'm sure that as a sheriff's wife, she learned how to stand up for herself and make sure that nobody was going to threaten her. Anne Powell, wife of William Dummer Powell, defended her property, and later she wrote to her husband, "We have endured privation, we can endure greater." Angelique Gibbons, wife of Major James Gibbons, superintendent of the Indian Department, remained in her family home, and she became a medical attendant to a number of warriors whom the major had led into battle. Angelique and her 9 children suffered days of plunder by group after group of intruders who stole carpets, curtains, sheets, knives, forks, clothing, a saddle, and a double set of harnesses. They were having a great time plundering the town of York, as well as burning the Parliament buildings. Elizabeth Dorenzi, niece Selby, remained to care for her sick father, and Major General Schaeff had Elizabeth Selby hide the public treasury funds, and the money was later turned over as part of the capitulation agreement, but she'd had actually hid the money away. After the war, Elizabeth started the Loyal and Patriotic Society of Upper Canada to relieve suffering among the loyal population and to recognize meritorious service in defending the province against the Americans. And if you go to Fort York, they actually have a medal on display that was handed out to one of the soldiers for meritorious service. An 1814 letter by the rector of the town's Anglican parish, the Reverend John Strawn, Anne Strawn's husband, stated that the idea for the society came from Elizabeth Selby, the daughter of the colony's Receiver General, Prideaux Selby. The presidency of the society, however, went to Thomas Scott, the Providence Chief Justice. Woman could not be entrusted to run such an organization. And it's interesting because that attitude continued well on into the late 1800s and into the 1900s. In the late 1800s, we have Elizabeth Mcmaster, who started the Humane Society in Toronto, and then as an offshoot of the Humane Society, she started caring for children. And she approached some of the very wealthy men in town about providing funding to start up a hospital for sick children. And John Ross Robinson took it on, and he decided that he was going to take over running the hospital and administering the things, because Elizabeth Mcmaster was a weak woman. Well, Elizabeth Mcmaster went on to found Bloorview Hospital for Children. So she definitely was not a weak woman. Yeah. The first monies that the society went to providing warm clothing for the soldiers, and later it went to individuals in need. Widow Clark received 3 payments from the society for her kindness during the war. She had cared for and boarded people in her home who were in need of assistance, and she also received money for burying Betty Feathers. In 1817, the remainder of the money held by the society was handed over to the New Society for the Relief of Strangers in Distress, and this fund was to provide care for new people arriving in the town. Oh, I didn't put it there. Oh, here it is. The document that I have here is transcriptions of all of the records for that particular society. When you look through it, they're doing things like providing housing for strangers who have arrived in town and don't have a place to stay for the night. They're also providing things like beef and flour for families who were in need of food because funds were very short. So if you want, you can take a look at that later. Next one I'm going to talk about, and I'm getting towards the end of my talk today, are women in Upper Canada. With the men away at war, the women were left to run the family farms and businesses, tend to the children, care for the wounded, provide food for the table, and bravely defend their homes. These were not weak women. On December the 10th, 1813, Brigadier General George B. McClure decided to destroy the town of Newark, and Newark is present-day Niagara-on-the-Lake. Residents were given 4 hours' notice to vacate their homes as they were to be torched. And when we're talking about those homes being torched, we're talking about women living in the homes with children. Men are off at war. The only men who may be around are elderly, parents. They have no horses because the horses have been confiscated and taken for war purposes. And any carts that they might have had have been taken for war purposes. They have very little to gather together, and they've only got 4 hours in which to do it. Women and children were forced out of their homes into the freezing cold and snow. Charlotte Dixon, wife of a local lawyer, was sick at home in bed, and she was carried out into the snow in her bed. The bed was put in the middle of a snowbank, and her house was torched. Mrs. Campbell, widow of Captain Donald Campbell, and her family were evicted and forced to walk for miles before finding shelter, and her youngest child, who was just a toddler at the time, died of exposure en route. People in the surrounding countryside came to the assistance of the homeless. People were living in dire poverty. They didn't have much. When the American soldiers came, they took everything. They went into their homes, they took all the food items that they could find. They took, as I said before, the poultry from the barn. They took the cows, they took the milk, they took everything they could find. So there was very little for the people at the time. In retaliation, the British invaded the American side of the Niagara River on December 19th, 1813, setting to all the towns along the river. Who were they hurting at this point in time? The women. the women and the children. Negotiations to end the war started in 1813. The peace treaty, which restored the status quo, was signed at Ghent in December of 1814. The 2-year war had devastating consequences for women and children on both sides of the border. The following document shows the effect on the families of men killed on April 27th, I've got the wrong date there, 1813, at the garrison of York. And this is the return of militia killed in the attack on the fort of York. And if you look up there, the line is pointing up to a Matthias Saunders. And when Matthias Saunders died, there's one column for killed in action. There's another one underneath, a wife. He had a wife. And then there's 6 out at the side. And then it goes on to state that one of them is a child at the breast. So this was a baby. And this woman's left with 6 children on her hands. For the family of Matthias Saunders and his wife Elizabeth McLeany, the end of the war was not status quo. Elizabeth, who had been born in 1780 in New York, was left with 6 small children to raise. A plaque in the Thornhill Cemetery incorrectly identifies the death date of Matthias. They have it recorded as November, while he was killed April 27, 1813 at the garrison of York. So this is what happened to the women of 1812. I'm greatly indebted to Kelly Nesbitt, Administrative Coordinator at Fort York, for willingly sharing her research paper, Nothing More or Less Than Devils, Women in the Military Establishments in its various branches in British North America, 1800 to 1830 with me. And also on Saturday, when I should have been at the spelling bee, I was at a conference at the garrison of Fort York run by the Women's History Network on women in the War of 1812, and Kelly Nesbitt took us on a tour at the end of the day and talked to us about women who had stayed at the garrison. I'm also indebted to Richard Gerard, historian for the City of Toronto, who provided further assistance for me. And that's my talk for today. Thank you for listening.